Whose Life Is It Anyway? The movie where everything is made up and the points don't matter. Actually, this is a movie about a quadriplegic trying to be released from a hospital so that he can die. It does actually have quite a few jokes in it, though. Richard Dreyfuss is the main man here. He plays a sculptor named Ken Harrison, who is in a car accident and becomes mostly paralyzed, unable to sculpt. He spends a lot of his time in the hospital making jokes, an acerbic wit, but underneath that, an existential nightmare. This movie starts out with Ken Harrison, Richard Dreyfuss's character, working on a statue in downtown Boston. You can see the Custom House in the background. It's a Calder-esque statue, perfect for the 80s. This movie's from 1981. Everyone seems happy to be working on that. Dreyfuss's muse, Pat, his girlfriend, is there. He's got students there. It seems like he's some kind of professor. They're helping out. Everybody's happy. He's got a sports car. They talk about what to make for dinner. An idyllic life. Honestly, maybe too idyllic. And it kind of seems like a B-movie at the beginning of this film. Harrison takes off in his car and crashes into a truck. Here we get the opening credits. This movie has strange pacing in some ways. Maybe some of the choices are nice, just a bit different, but some of them are a little weird. After the credits, we get a quick montage of the doctors working on Harrison. John Cassavetes plays the main doctor, Dr. Emerson. We see some of the operation. We see some doctors conversing and concurring, surely, with each other. And then we cut to after the surgery with Harrison in his hospital bed joking away. The nurses are there. Pat is there. He seems kind of upbeat. They're talking about the future. They're talking about future clients. But there is some stuff sort of lurking beneath the surface here. Some form of alienation, things he can't do by himself. He's reliant on other people. Is it wearing at him? At the end of this scene, not a spoiler, we're just talking about the beginning of the movie here, but at the end of the scene, there is a little twist, which is that we learn it's been 6 months since his accident. Bit of a dramatic reveal. If he's been there for 6 months, then he isn't an optimistic patient after a successful surgery. This isn't, maybe there's some kind of coping mechanism instead. Long-term coping mechanism. 6 months is a long time. If he's been there for 6 months, how good can his prospects be? Why is he talking about future clients? Why is he talking about things going back to normal? Maybe this is normal. This is kind of a nice twist in some ways, but it's also a bit weird that the movie doesn't show us anything about Harrison waking up from surgery. It doesn't tell us what happens when he is first admitted, how he reacts. In many ways, this movie is a character study of him, but we're kind of missing this crucial piece of the story. Most likely, this is because this movie is an adaptation of a play. And my guess is that the play starts 6 months after the accident. When they made the movie, they tacked on the beginning, the outdoor part, and the crash. Presumably they don't have a car up on stage in the play. So they try to... It's always an interesting question of how you sort of build out a play into a movie, and here they do this by adding a beginning. But I guess they didn't want to try to write in the stuff that happens between that beginning, between the accident, and 6 months in when the movie starts. And you can sort of understand that, but like I said, it makes the movie a little bit weird. And this isn't the last time that the movie's going to make a little bit of a jump. It's not the last time that the movie's going to be slightly oddly paced. We get some storylines throughout that are started, but not quite resolved. We get some pieces that could be carried further, some loose ends. And really, even the big ending of this movie, to some extent, is a little bit half-baked. So far, I haven't said many good things about Whose Life Is It Anyway, but it actually does have a lot of things going for it. I didn't watch this by accident. The cast is great, for instance. Bob Balaban is in the movie, too. The acting is mostly good. And there's some strong characters. Overall, the film has emotional intensity, and it has some depth. This film has a couple of sequences in black and white, but originally the plan was to make the whole thing in black and white. And I guess they actually shot a version in black and white and a version in color. They screened both. They did test screenings for both, and they did the black. They chose color only at the last second. But clearly, they were trying to do something refined. You don't shoot a movie in black and white in 1981 unless you think you're making something kind of refined, right? Now, as it is, there's one sequence, maybe two, in black and white, and it's kind of a cheesy flashback scene that honestly doesn't really need to be in the movie. Not a home run, but the movie gets some of the idea is right. When I was first looking into this movie, I think my main worry, and maybe my main curiosity too, was if it was going to be like some other sort of mainstream morality films. Something that comes to mind, for instance, is Defending Your Life from 1991 or Fearless from 1993. These are both movies about mortality that have some intensity but very little sophistication, I think. Death is a big thing, and movies about death can often elicit very strong reactions. So you will find some very positive reviews of those movies. Some people raving about them. They aren't bad movies, but they were disappointing for me. People say that Defending Your Life is life-changing. And if a movie improves your life, hey, that's great. But to me, the message of that film isn't really anything more than seize the day, not a complex movie. So is this going to be another sort of film like that? A movie that has some intensity because it invokes death, but doesn't really have much depth. Well, I don't think it is. This movie actually does have real substance and has some real uncertainty. And a lot of that just kind of comes from the basic premise of the movie. I think Right to Die is an interesting issue. Death with dignity, maybe you'd call it, if you're in favor, I guess. For many people, it isn't obvious if there is a right to die or not. I mean, I think some people might have a strong intuition about this, but I think most people don't have a firm moral intuition about that issue in general. Maybe in certain contexts they might. Maybe talking about a 95-year-old who can't get out of bed or something. It's also not an issue that's clearly aligned with a political party, which is kind of cool. Conservatives are maybe more likely to be religious and have a religious framework that does not acknowledge a right to die, and that sort of ties this all in with suicide or something like that. But conservatives, of course, might also believe in personal freedom, which would seemingly suggest that you should be able to do whatever you want with your own body, including, ending your life. Interestingly enough, there's actually no religion in this movie at all, I think, not mentioned. If this movie had come out in the golden age of Hollywood, I guarantee you that there would be clergy involved. There would be a priest who would be a central character, be a battle between a priest and someone else. Of course, at the time, that would be the only way you could get it past the production code. Anyway, this movie does have some central ambiguity to it, partly coming from this issue, and partly because of the way they execute it. Harrison decides, after being in the hospital for a while, that he wants to die. That there's no point in continuing on without being able to sculpt, without being able to make the most of his life, without being able to live a life at all, and with the life that he can lead just continuously reminding him of what had been, what had come before, and ways things could be better, constantly reminding him of things he's missing out on. Of course, the hospital, and Dr. Emerson particularly, do not want him to. Dr. Emerson, unfortunately, is kind of a one-dimensional character. Cassavetes probably could have taken on a lot more. Emerson's viewpoint is really just, this is a hospital, we're supposed to keep people alive. And look at all the energy and time we've invested in keeping you alive. Look how much we've healed you already from coming into the hospital. Tons of injuries. Now you're paralyzed, but your body is recovering in many other ways. Like I said, a bit one-dimensional. It's just sort of like, well, we're doctors, we got to heal them. I think most doctors don't actually feel that. I think there's plenty of thought in medicine about these sorts of issues, end-of-life issues, about the best way to care for somebody. I think doctors are generally somewhat wise about these issues. Maybe in 81 things were different. I don't really know. Now, it's not just as simple as the fact that Cassavetes is saying, no, I operated on you, I won't let you go. There are real or deeper issues at play here. In particular, the thing that is invoked is that Harrison is said to be depressed, not of sound mind, to make the decision, right? And this seems pretty reasonable. Do you want somebody who is, in general, in a state where they're inclined to think negatively, to be making huge decisions about ending their own life? Perhaps not. Perhaps Harrison doesn't have a clear picture. Perhaps he shouldn't be the one deciding this issue. Is he depressed? It's hard to know. You see psychiatrists in the film try to figure this out, examining him, talking to him, trying to figure out if he is of sound mind. Easier said than done. The audience also tries to figure this out, right? As we try to pick a side a little bit, we try to think, is he in a state to make this kind of decision, and it's hard to know. Usually, in the face of some kind of big traumatic injury, the narrative is that you should stay positive. You know, it's a challenge. These setbacks are things, you get knocked down, you get up again, right? You should stay positive, you should keep moving forward, and that you'll be able to adapt. Dr. Emerson says in the movie, you'll never believe what people can adapt to. That's probably true. He talks about other people who have gone through much worse. He also says, hey, this is not my first rodeo. I've seen people go through this before. You have not. And in this context, right to die is sort of positioned as giving up, right? We're not talking about a 95-year-old. We're talking about a person who presumably could continue living in a meaningful capacity. But the person doesn't think so. The financial weight of continuing to live is brought up a few times in this movie, which is interesting. That's another angle on it, completely not really a morality angle or a different view on morality. It's interesting, you know, sometimes people will say, as irrefutable evidence for the progress we've made as a society, look, human lifespans are higher than ever. People in America are living longer than ever. Now, this is not, I don't know if we had a bit of a setback with a certain global health issue in the last few years, but generally before that, lifespan was trending upwards. And that seems like, oh, who could argue against that? Surely this would be good. But sometimes I think about going to visit my grandparents, for instance, in a retirement home, very fancy retirement home for some of them, where a huge amount of resources is being used to keep people alive just a little bit longer, right? And you think, wait a minute, we were saying that living longer is just this like unquestionably good thing, this obviously, you know, this transcendental metric, average lifespan going up, got to be great, right? Well, are those last years really as valuable? Are they really worth the money? There are some interesting things like that. You get into pretty weird, fraught moral territory when you start asking questions like this, things people don't really want to talk about. Anyway, like I said, the financial weight of continuing to live is mentioned here. The reliance that Harrison would have on doctors for the rest of his life to be able to have any existence at all. So they give us both sides of the story, really. An interesting question when making a movie about a technical field, health, medicine, highly technical field, is how much technical information and detail do you want in the movie, right? Obviously, most people are not doctors and don't know how to interpret really complicated things. But on the other hand, you know, movies that teach you something, movies where you learn something, movies that are realistic and that really expose the issue, surely that's a good thing, right? So it's always a bit of a balancing act. This movie, is it medically realistic? It seems close enough, I guess, for me. One of the mechanisms they use in the movie to sort of boil all of the conflict down into something that's very accessible is they talk about Valium, right? Harrison is on a number of drugs. One of them is Valium, and people generally, I think, understand Valium, what it does and its effects. And they talk throughout the movie about upping his dosage, right? He becomes a little bit perturbed sometimes. There are moments where there's some moments where he's really making, in some ways, philosophical breakthroughs for himself when he really begins to find clarity on the fact that he does not want to continue living, right? That becomes more and more certain. One of the main responses from the doctors is to increase the amount of Valium that he's prescribed. Interesting. Is that, you know, a good idea? Are these, you know, suicidal thoughts that should be quelled with drugs? Or is it, in fact, sort of a sham to keep on living just in this, like, sort of artificially satiated state when you truly don't have anything left to live for? Hard to know. And there are some kind of profound questions there. I mean, like I said, you talk about the people in the old folks' home, but you also talk about people who get through life more generally in some sort of subdued state, who perhaps aren't happy, but have some sort of dependence, chemical or otherwise, that they use to keep going through the scary world. Interesting. So the movie invokes a lot of truly complicated questions about life, whether it's worth living. The central dilemma of the movie, like I said, is nicely done, and the movie mainly avoids taking sides. We, for the most part, don't get any kind of authoritative judgment. The movie is fairly neutral. I think this is really important. You know, we've covered a couple like Cronenberg movies on this channel recently, and that's one of the hallmarks of Cronenberg. I think one of the best things about his movies is that they are not morally outraged. In fact, they have almost no moral position in them at all. They just point the camera at some extremely whack stuff and let you think about it, right? I've talked a gazillion times on this channel about how uncertainty to me is one of the most important things in film. Well, uncertainty is, you kind of need to have a neutral film to have any uncertainty in it, right? It's kind of the opposite of a moralistic or didactic film, right? Those are movies where the scales are tipped very heavily, where events are contrived to make it clear what the authors think, what position the movie is taking, and how you should feel too. Well, surely the opposite of that is better. This movie, for the most part, does it, but it doesn't make it all the way. At the end of the movie, a judge comes out and more or less tells us how to feel. Talk a little bit more about the ending in the end, but a bit of a shame from my mind. But for the most part, the movie doesn't do that, and there is a lot of genuine questions that the audience is asking about both the general concept of the right to die, also the even more general concept about living and what it's all about on this planet, in this existence, and also some specific questions about Harrison and whether or not he's depressed, whether or not he's thinking clearly, and what he should do. There's also some interesting territory in this movie in that it, to some extent, portrays the hospital as the bad guys. Not entirely. I mean, some of the nurses are quite nice, but Dr. Emerson is sort of the antagonist in the movie, or it's portrayed as that. It's a kind of interesting character. You could wonder why exactly Harrison gets sort of really wound up in his dislike for Emerson, almost cartoonishly so. And you wonder, are we supposed to read this straight? Is Emerson a villain of the film, or is Harrison sort of wound up? Is he sort of rattled by Emerson's authority or something like that, by Emerson's embodied power, by Emerson being able to walk around and use his arms or something like that, right? Kind of interesting question. But to some extent, I think it's fair to say that the hospital has a sinister side to it in this movie. It's not the only side. But this reminds me a little bit of the movie The Hospital, which I reviewed on this channel, which is not a great movie, but it has some interesting things in it. And one of them is that it shows us a lot of error and poor judgment happening in a hospital by the workers there. This is not very common in mainstream films. Even now that we have had an explosion of hospital dramas on television, the doctors are still the good guys. And if they make mistakes, it's part of a character arc, right? It's the sad episode, right? Where somebody misjudges something. It's not an overarching statement about medicine and modernity, right? We've talked about a number of movies from the 70s, 80s, like The Hospital, that are kind of trying to get at something, at some sort of hubris in medicine or something like that. In some ways, even in successful movies, right? We talk about that heart transplant movie, Threshold, right? Generally positive movie, but in some ways the health system, the medicine, the hospital is just right on the edge of something, right on the edge of disaster, right on the edge of modernity, something like that. And this movie goes in with that a little bit. Like I said, it's not clear exactly that Emerson is like some bad guy, but there is some institutional questions. There are some institutional questions being asked here about how exactly, what ought medicine be about? And that is obviously tied up right with modernity. Okay. This movie, interesting about it is it has a little bit more sexual energy in it than you might expect. A huge percentage of Harrison's jokes are about the nurses. He has a lot of non-sexual contact with them. They scrub him. They take care of him on an intimate level. It's no mystery, I guess, why sex might be on his mind. He has this intimate contact. And I guess sex also is kind of an elephant in the room for a quadriplegic. If there's one thing that Harrison hates, it's elephants. Elephants in the room. He doesn't beat around the bush. This is maybe one of his main personality traits, is that he wants to go directly to the heart of the issue. He wants to talk about stuff. He wants the real talk. He wants to know. He wants to know the truth. He wants to know what people think. All these things, right? This is maybe not what doctors are always used to doing, is telling people the full story, partly because it's very difficult to, but maybe there is some hint of paternalism there as well. This is a good word for this movie. Paternalism. Dr. Emerson, is he too paternal? So in this movie, we get almost constant innuendo. And this makes the movie lighter and also darker, because these jokes, some of them are kind of funny, but they also seem very likely to be backed up by loss. Harrison is in some ways haunted by his desexualization in the film, his castration, you might say, I guess, in the academic sense and perhaps in the literal sense as well. This movie is almost 40 years old. I get the feeling that at the time, Harrison's sexual candor might have been seen as admirable or even progressive, right? He's open with his desires. Maybe his grumpiness is kind of endearing as well. These days, I think people might get a little bit tired of his antics. That said, the sort of sexualization that happens does tie into something that I think is a big virtue of the movie, which is that the hospital here is sort of profoundly a human place. Now, I know I just said that in some ways it's paternalistic and it's like this modern mechanism that doesn't understand people or something like that. And that is to some extent true, and it's to some extent part of the system. But there are also a lot of individuals working at the hospital who develop very strong relationships. This is a personable film. The relationships are the star of it in some ways. Harrison's relationship with the orderlies, Harrison's relationship with the nurses, the doctors. A question that is lingering in the background of this film is how the staff at the hospital will feel after Harrison gets released, if he does. They connect with him, right? They become attached to him. Even the ones that believe in his plight might not want to say goodbye. In fact, the people that support him most will probably be the ones that miss him most. There's another little question about the right to die there. What about the other people in your life? Is it self-centered, what Harrison is doing? There's a couple of places where his actions do seem particularly self-centered. Interesting. So, like I said, we get a fair amount of emotional intensity. We get some interesting themes, some balance. There are issues with the movie, though. I think one of the big ones is that it's not very thorough. What do I mean by that? Well, when I reviewed it, I Never Sang for My Mother. That one thing that really stuck out to me about that movie was how thorough it is. That's a movie about some people, brother and sister, trying to figure out what to do with their aging father, the father that they never sang for. Okay, I think my camera overheated there. It's rather toasty in New York these days. I want to finish this up, though. So we were talking about thoroughness, and I mentioned I Never Sang for My Father. That's a movie that's very thorough. It's about siblings trying to figure out what to do with their aging father. And often movies, there's no real incentive to be extremely thorough, because what we're trying to do is create some sort of dramatic problem. We're trying to create some big tension, some huge issue. And usually, considering all the options, we'll sort of water down the problem there. Worst case scenario is that there's actually a way to solve the problem that you don't want to mention, right? Or maybe it's just boring to talk about all the different options. And so usually they're just sort of left out. Instead, we kind of build up this big problem, this big issue. Well, I Never Sang for My Father is a movie, very mature movie, great movie, one of the best movies I've reviewed on the channel. And one of the big virtues that it has is that it really goes into all the different things. They really think about all the different things they might do with Dad, and they don't really pan out. This movie is not thorough. Just while watching it, you think, well, wait a minute, like, didn't they consider this angle? Didn't they consider that angle? And the central, question of this movie is whether or not a guy should end his life, right? You're not thorough in that situation. That's not ideal. So one very simple example, for instance, is that, like Dreyfus, Harrison says, I can't sculpt. I can never sculpt again. So what's the point in living, or something like that? My life was in my hands. But what about writing books about sculpting, right? What about teaching sculpting? Surely he could find meaning in doing that. And they mention at one point a little bit about using a dictation machine to write books, but this sort of breaks down for other reasons that is never revisited. So like I said, just watching the movie, you can name, just off the top of your head, a number of things that you would surely be thinking about in the real world if this happened to you, but that are just not addressed in this movie. So that's a little bit annoying. I do want to talk a little bit about the ending of the movie. There'll be some spoilers here. So the final shot of the movie is a hand, right? And this, again, sort of messes up the whole neutral moral frame because it's showing us pretty clearly, what matters is that you have control, right? What matters is that you have some sense of control power in your life. Interesting little metaphor being used throughout, the hand, right? The hand is important for sculpting. It's the artist uses the hand. I think they also compare it to the hand in the Sistine Chapel touching the thing. I don't know enough about art or the Bible to close the loop there, but we also end with the hand. You need to have control. Now, the ironic thing is that the ending of the movie is actually maybe slightly ambiguous. And I guess one way to read this is that there's a bit of a not comedic, but there's sort of a cute reversal. Harrison fights to leave the hospital, but by the time it comes around, maybe he's made enough connections, maybe he's made enough friends, maybe he has enough self-esteem that actually he no longer is depressed and he will choose to stay. Now, the choice is his. What matters is the hand, right? It's not really clear if that's what they're saying at the end. I think it's still fairly likely that he's going to leave. Not really known. I do like that we get a little bit of an opening, just for a minute, of Emerson. There's a little bit of healing there. Now, it doesn't really pan out. But there's a little bit of a moment. They open the door a little bit for that character being more complex. Like I said, in some ways, there's some half-baked elements in this movie. There's places that are just not that thorough. And there's places where, the movie just seems a little bit contrived because they don't look at all the different possible angles of the situation. And the end kind of has the same thing going for it a little bit. But, oh well. One other thing to mention about this movie that's kind of interesting is that apparently Richard Dreyfuss doesn't remember making this movie because he was deep in the grasp of an addiction, a drug addiction at the time. He could only work for 3 hours a day or something like that because he was so sick. And it's interesting how that might tie into some of the questions about mental state, about life, and how to live it going on in the movie. But that, in 2 parts, is Whose Life Is It Anyway? An okay movie.